Welcome, everyone. We are going to have a very interesting episode as we are discussing school start times, academic achievement, circadian rhythm, and interesting flexible school start system. And we have amazing guest for this episode. She has master's degree in neuroscience from University College London and PhD in chronobiology from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. Currently, she's working as a postdoctoral researcher at Department for Sport and Health Sciences at Technical University of Munich. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest, Dr. Anna Biller. Welcome, Anna.
Hello, thank you very much.
Yeah, nice to have you in the podcast. And you have done interesting studies about school start times, circadian rhythm, and academic achievement, among other things. Could you give kind of a overview of studies you have done?
Yeah, so as many of you who have children probably know, it's a bit of a challenge to get teenage ready and prepared to go to school in the morning. So this is something that we really observe worldwide, that they don't really have enough sleep and that their sleep wake times are quite delayed in comparison to adults, for example, or children. That's very normal. That's very biological. It's also socially influenced, but it's very biological as well. And so we were interested in our studies whether changing something about the system, about the school system, and in particular about the start times could be beneficial for their health. And so they would also maybe benefit in other areas such as well-being. And because people always ask, and because, of course, for policymakers, it's also important if they evaluate to make changes. We also looked at their achievement measured in grades. And because there the results were a bit difficult or unclear, I also did a meta-analysis. So this is like bringing some papers together and analyze their results together, basically. And there I found that it was very difficult to find any clear picture as well. So overall, just to sum this up, what we found was that when you do delay school start times, for example, by let's say half an hour, an hour or so, you do already find some benefits for children's sleep. So they sleep longer and usually also objectively better subjectively as well. Yeah.
So mainly about teenagers and how is the circadian rhythm kind of delays at some age, and that's the problem. What's the age, and do we know what's causing it? Why does it happen?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Of course, since many people think that this is just made up. So really, what we can observe over the years, when you're a really small baby, you don't have a circadian rhythm yet, and then you develop it over the first months of your life. And then, you're a child, and then when you become a teenager, a lot of things happen. You go into adolescence, puberty, and so many hormonal changes take place. Your brain matures a lot. Lots of learning also going on apart from the phase during childhood. Puberty is another really important phase of life where you learn a lot, where a lot of connections in the brain are still strengthened. Your prefrontal cortex, for example, still matures. And so this just takes a lot of energy. So apart from the circadian rhythm that delays during this period, teenagers still need a lot of sleep as well. So more than adults. So they need on average like 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night. And in terms of circadian rhythm, since you asked what are the reasons, well, this is really still very much research. So we just have some hints. We just know from many observational studies, it's also in mammals in general, not just in humans, but also other mammals and also, for example, if you look at more like tribes, for example, other populations on Earth, this is a very, very common thing that always happens during puberty. And so, we do think that it's very biological. We also see some evidence that maybe, for example, light sensitivity is changed during puberty. So the way your eyes perceive light, and then this is translated into a signal for your biological clock, for your circadian rhythm. This might change. And also, since I already talked about sleep, there is this homeostatic process. So the longer you are awake, the more sleepy you get. So everyone knows this. And so basically there's some evidence that shows that in teenagers this might be altered. So actually this accumulation of sleep pressure, what we say, is lower in teenagers. So it just takes longer for them to get sleepy. And so actually this reaches its sort of peak around 2021, and then we sort of become earlier again. And then in very late age, so when let's say 50, 60 and onwards, everything gets a bit messy because then you have this aging factor where you have more diseases. And so it's a bit tricky to know exactly, but in general, we still advance with your rhythm.
Yeah, so you said that as a babies are creating the rhythm, and then it gets delayed in the teenage, and then it gets earlier. So you would see their kind of a lifespan effect throughout the lifespan.
Yeah. So you would, as a population, you can study this. So you would sort of delay, and then advance again. But also as an individual, when you follow individual people, you can see that. But still, there are differences always between people. And so this is what we call the typical chronotype. So whether you're more of an early type of person or late type of person, this already develops earlier. So when you're a child. But on a population level, teenagers on average are then still very much delayed. So they would be night owls, what we say.
Yeah, and I have heard about the chronotypes that it would have the one theory is that within a tribe, it was beneficial that some people were staying up late and then some people were waking early. So basically in a tribe, somebody was awake almost all the time. Is there any scientific base on this?
I mean, it's a bit hard to research that when you have to go back into time, but of course it is a reasonable theory. I mean, it's one of these evolutionary theories where it's hard to test, but it sort of does make sense if you think about it, because depending on where you live, of course, you might have predators, or you need to make sure that you don't get attacked. And so in a way that does make sense. Yeah, it's hard to test it in that way. And also actually what we see when we study people that don't have electricity, for example, that follow more the natural light-dark rhythm, we do see that their chronotype is actually not so much, so the distribution of the chronotype is not so extreme. So basically, you wouldn't have like a very, very early and a very, very late type in such a population. So it's much more, they're more so towards an average chronotype. Whereas in our environment now, where we have a lot of artificial light and do a lot of stuff indoor, a lot of work indoor, we say it's a Zeitgeber. It's a German word for time giver. So this light, which is the main time giver, Zeitgeber, for the circadian clock, basically hasn't such a strong impact anymore, and then everything sort of dilutes. So basically, we sort of spread out as a distribution of the chronotypes, and so it all gets a bit muddled up. And if you take again the argument with you would have very early and very late types, so you would cover the entire range of the night or morning. I would say, it does sort of make sense, but I mean, we don't know what people did at the time. So
yeah,
so it could be, but yeah.
Yeah. No, good. Interesting. I have a camper van, and I always notice that I sleep better because there's only like battery light, which is not very bright. So I think it's more like the natural rhythm. And how do you see with the teenagers? Probably smartphones are a problem that you get blue light exposure quite late in the night.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is exactly the point that, I mean, apart from the already altered daily light exposure where you basically spend too much time inside and don't get enough sunlight, then you have increased light in the evening where it's supposed to be dark. And so this is, first of all, of course, the blue light. So all blue light emitting devices like phones or screens or, tablets, all these kind of things, they are enriched with blue light. Also LEDs, by the way, which is why we as chronobiologists really don't like LEDs. And blue light, why is that a problem? Well, first of all, because blue light suppresses melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone that gets secreted in the evening, a few hours before you usually would go to bed. And it's a signal for the body to sort of, calm down, go to bed, prepare for sleep. And this is suppressed if you have a lot of blue light emitting devices and you're exposed to that light. And so everything shifts a bit later because you don't realize that you're supposed to go to bed because the signal, oh, you're sleepy, go to bed, doesn't arrive. And so that's one problem, but it's also the light intensity per se, so not even the color of the light, but the light intensity. And so, if you compare a campfire or one candle compared to like the lights that we have now, especially when you switch everything on and all the devices and so on, it's just too bright in the evening. And that again delays the rhythm. So apart from the biological effect that I said earlier, it's also the socially induced things that we do. So of course you could also say, okay, let's get rid of all the smartphones and let's just not let teenagers have any smartphones. But I mean, every parent probably knows that that's really hard to achieve and a very unlikely solution, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I can really see that. And you had interesting study about this flexible school start time. Could you tell more what is flexible start system or whatever you exactly call it?
Yeah, exactly. It's a bit like flexi time at work. We thought about it like that. So why flexible? So most studies or school system that change something, they always change it by a fixed amount. So let's say you even advance, like some schools in America, or delay school by 1 hour. So let's say instead of starting at 8 a.m., which is a very typical time for many schools around the world, you would start at 9. I mean, that's one thing what you could do, but then the entire system shifts later, right? So again, you could argue, and we don't know from evidence that's being researched at the moment, then you expose yourself to a later light again. And also you might do sports more so even later in the evening, and everything shift. And then maybe actually that could be a problem for your circadian rhythm. So even though you might get more sleep, you might counteract the benefits that you get by exposing yourself to a different light dark cycle, and then actually the benefit might be lost in the long term. But we don't know this. So even from my studies, I don't know, but that's just one theory behind this whole thing. And so the idea was if you maybe could decide every day for yourself if you want to start at 8 or at 9, then it's a more flexible system. And, depending on what you did the night before, because not every day is the same, you could decide for yourself whether you just need an hour more sleep today because you had a bad night's sleep the day before, something like this.
Mm.
So it just gives you more flexibility. And also it gives students more autonomy, they can decide for themselves. And I think that's something we shouldn't neglect also. It's a psychological aspect here as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So the teenager can choose whether they come at 8 or, for example, at 9, and then they make it up later on. What kind of things did you find? You tested this in schools, and what were the findings?
So I have to correct you there because that's an important detail. So in fact, they did not have to stay longer if they decided to attend school later. So that was a difference to all the other studies that investigated this. So every day they could decide whether to start at 8 or at 8:50. So I mean, we can say 9 for just easier to say that. But this first hour was a sort of self-study hour. So they had a specific curriculum that they had to go through every month. But for this very specific hour, they could do it, or they were supposed to do it themselves. So this is specific to the school because they want to improve autonomy and autonomous learning as well. And throughout the schedule of the school day, because every student had an individual timetable, they could, pick specific gap periods that they had, and then again do this sort of curriculum during that time. And so this made sure that they wouldn't just shift the entire day. They could still leave at the same time as before. It was just because the scheduling was just different. And I think that's just important to mention because it wasn't this fixed shift as in other studies. And what we find was, so you have to differentiate a bit between the short-term and the long-term effect, because we followed this up again after a year. And in the short term, we found basically exactly the time that they could spend more in bed, like 50 minutes, basically, they would also sleep longer. And so in terms of just their sleep, they just really benefited from this. So, and interestingly, it was both true for both genders and also for all chronotypes. So even, in teenagers, you also have early chronotypes. But even the early chronotypes, they don't get enough sleep for their age. So basically, even the ones who are earlier, they still slept longer because they were basically sleep deprived. And we did find this 1 year later as well, which was important because many studies don't follow this up. And you could imagine, just like from your own experience, when you're sleep deprived, you might, benefit the next 2 or 3 days and just sleep more. And then eventually you think, oh, I could use up this new time for, I don't know, spending more time playing games or spending more time on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. And this is, of course, this is what parents are scared of, or what, policymakers or educators are scared of, because then you have this massive investment in changing the system. But at the same time, after a year, the effect is gone. So this is, of course, what you want to avoid. And in our case, we saw that the benefit was a bit less, and especially boys actually reduced it a little bit. So they didn't sleep as long as the year before, but still, it was still very, very much there. So at least from my conclusion from this study, we can say it was effective also after a year, but there are hardly any studies who follow this up after a year or longer. So really the long-term effects, we don't really know.
So it would be beneficial. How difficult is it to set up in the schools that, like, how much challenges is there?
I mean, the problem, this is a really good point, and of course always an argument against changing anything. But I mean, the thing is, it really depends on the country and on the system, of course. Like, for example, in the US, this has been quite a major thing now. And in California, they made a law now that schools are not supposed to be open before, I think, 8:30. So they're not allowed to, high school, this is high schools, are not allowed to do that before 8:30. And there it was a massive, it took a massive effort for many, many different people, many stakeholders to get there. Here in Europe, it's really hard, especially in Germany. I mean, in other countries like the UK, for example, they already start later, but even they discuss to start even later than that. So it's definitely a movement, but it requires a lot of people and also views and, people on the round table to discuss it. Because why is it dependent on the school system? Well, like, for example, in the US, you have sports and those kind of things already integrated in high school. But here in Germany, you would do all those kind of extracurricular stuff or sports clubs and those kind of activities outside of school. So if you then change the school system, this is connected to it. So everyone else is affected. And so it is quite a major thing to change.
Yeah, I can see that.